Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today we're going to be talking about coming of age stories about Bildungsromans. If you don't know what a Bildungsroman is, it basically means a sort of coming of age story, but maybe it's a bit more specific than that. It means a book that focuses on a character growing up, usually from childhood to adulthood. I don't think that a Bildungsroman has to follow a character all the way to adulthood, but I think it probably does need to take place over a long period of time. It can't be like a brief coming of age story about a kind of coming of age moment, if you will. I don't think it can be one of those books that is about one summer where someone's life changes. I think it has to be spread over a long period of time. I really love these kind of novels. I really love a Bildungsroman. I really love a coming of age story and a book that kind of follows a character over many years. So I thought it'd be nice to make a video talking about some of my favourite Bildungsromans, and I was like, oh, I'll just do 10, and then I ended up with a list of 21. So here you go. We have lots of classic books, lots of contemporary books, and there are a lot of Victorian books on this list because the Victorians loved a Bildungsroman. I'm going to go through these books in chronological order, so we'll start with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte from 1847. Jane Eyre is a wonderful Bildungsroman following Jane Eyre from her childhood to her adulthood. We follow her neglected, lonely childhood, her experiences at school, what happens when she goes out to become a governess at the strange, mysterious house of Thornfield Hall, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful story. I love so many things about Jane Eyre, but one of the things I love most is the character growth and the psychological complexity of Jane Eyre as a character. It is a wonderful novel and a wonderful Bildungsroman. Another wonderful Bildungsroman is David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. This is a novel from 1850 that follows David Copperfield from his birth pretty much until his adulthood, and we are following David's unhappy childhood, lots of unhappy childhoods in this video. What happens after his mother decides to remarry someone who doesn't like him, and everything kind of goes on from there. We follow the ups and downs of David's life as he moves all about the Victorian class system and eventually ends up trying to make it as a writer. It's a wonderful novel. David has such a complex inner life, and there's also so many fascinating characters. One thing I really love about David Copperfield is how we meet lots of characters in David's childhood who then turn up again in his adulthood, and it's just really great fun. Next, I wanted to recommend Olive by Dinah Muloch-Craik, another wonderful novel also from 1850, really wonderful Bildungsroman. This follows the character of Olive from her birth into her adulthood, and Olive has scoliosis, so her spine is a slightly different shape, and she doesn't therefore look the same as the people around her, and she's told from an early age that because of this she's not going to be able to have a conventional Victorian woman's life. People tell her she's unlikely to get married and have children, and therefore she decides to pursue a different path and becomes an artist. And this novel is about Olive fighting against the prejudices that she faces and claiming a life for herself, and it's so good. It's so good. I also wanted to recommend Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. This is a novel in verse from 1856, which tells the story of Aurora Leigh. A Bildungsroman does very often have a character name in the title, but this book is about Aurora Leigh, her childhood, her relationships with those around her, her attempts to become a poet, and it's just a really rich, wonderful novel. As I said, told in verse. It is a epic poem, I suppose, and I just really love this. I would say that as Victorian poetry goes, it's very accessible, and I just loved following the story of Aurora Leigh. Next, we're back to Dinah Muloch-Craik and her novel John Halifax Gentleman from 1856, which is kind of a dual Bildungsroman because we're following two characters, Phineas, the narrator, and his friend John Halifax. We follow both of them as they grow up. A lot of the book kind of follows John Halifax's aims to move upwards within the Victorian class system. When we first meet him, he has nothing, and he wants to become a gentleman, and the book follows him as he tries to do that, but it's all told from the perspective of his friend Phineas, and I love the friendship between them, but I also find the kind of dual coming of age story really interesting, so I'd really recommend John Halifax Gentleman if you're interested in this kind of book. And then we're back to Dickens with Great Expectations, another wonderful, wonderful Bildungsroman. Great Expectations follows the character of Pip. We first meet him when he is a small child, then we go on to follow him throughout his childhood and his early adulthood, as he moves around within the Victorian class system. Lots of that in Victorian Bildungsromans. He comes from a working class background. He lives with his sister and brother-in-law. His brother-in-law is a blacksmith. Pip is expecting to become a blacksmith, but one day he is told that he has great expectations, that someone has left him a fortune, and everything goes on from there. It is such a wonderful, rich book, and I feel like it's one of those great Bildungsromans where I find Pip so frustrating through so much of the book, but that is because he has his journey to go on and he has his lessons to learn, because he's really young and he's got a long way to go, and the character development in Great Expectations is fantastic. I love this book a lot and really, really recommend it. I also wanted to recommend Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Now, this is probably less of a strict Bildungsroman than some of the other ones we've been talking about. It does span a number of years, but not as many years as quite a lot of these other books. We don't follow the character of Molly, the main character, through her whole life. But we do follow her through some very, very pivotal years in her life. The first scene takes place when she is a young child, but we then quite soon skip to when she's about 16, and then we follow her over several years as she grows up, as her father remarries and a new stepmother and stepsister come into their lives. And it is Molly's coming of age story, and a lot of the book kind of focuses on Molly as a character learning to understand herself more, and learning to control her emotions and her anger at times, and I love Molly as a character so much, and I love this novel and how Molly's understanding of the world grows throughout it, and I just think it's a really rich character study, and if you like a coming of age story, you'll love Wives and Daughters. We're going to move quickly across the pond to talk about Little Women by Louisa May Alcott from 1869. It's been a long time since I read Little Women, and I read the version of Little Women that is usually published in the UK, at least, where Little Women and Good Wives are kind of bound up as one book. So in my head they are one book, but I know they're not actually. But across those two books, you have more of a Bildungsroman because you see more of the characters coming of age. Little Women is the story of four sisters growing up in the US in the mid-19th century. These four sisters are very different, and we see how they grow up and how they change and how they change each other. It's been a long time, as I said, since I last read Little Women, but I do think it is a wonderful novel, and the coming of age story is really fascinating to follow. Then I also wanted to mention Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy from 1895. This probably falls into a more similar category to Wives and Daughters, in that it spans a less long period of time. We do first meet Jude when he's a child, but we skip forward into his kind of late adolescence quite quickly. Jude is a fascinating character. He comes from a working class background, has never had much money, but he loves learning and he really wants to go to university. And a lot of this book kind of follows his attempts to go to university and his attempts to become a scholar and the difficulties he faces in that, as well as looking at his relationship with one particular woman. And we follow Jude over a long period of time and see the ups and downs of his life. Lots of downs. It is not the happiest of books, but I do think it's incredible and it is a real favourite of mine. And I do think that if you like Bildungsromans, you will find it an interesting book. And then I also wanted to mention the last Victorian book on this list before we move into the 20th century, The Beth book by Sarah Grand from 1897. I love all of these books, and I wouldn't say the Beth book is like my absolute favourite of these 21 books. That would probably be Wives and Daughters. Yes, it probably would be. But I think the Beth book is possibly the best Bildungsroman I have ever read in terms of like the way it looks at the psychological development of a character through childhood and adulthood with such realism and complexity. So the Beth book follows the character of Beth from her birth until her adulthood, and it looks like at the development of Beth's mind in such a fascinating way, as well as having a lot of really interesting, complicated things to say about the position of women in the late 19th century, the expectations and limitations within Beth's life, and the difficulties that she faces because of what society expects from women at this point in time, is so interestingly drawn, and the book has like so much to say about gender and the position of women in the late 19th century, and it's fantastic. I really, really cannot recommend the Beth book enough. I think if you're interested in gender history and if you're interested in social change in the 19th century, if you're interested in Bildungsromans, it's so good. And like I said, I have never read a more like realistic exploration of how a child's mind develops into an adult's mind. It's so good. Okay, we're into the 20th century, and I wanted to mention Young Anne by Dorothy Whipple. This is a wonderful coming of age story story looking at the character of Anne, who is quite an introverted, shy child, and we follow her through her childhood and her adulthood. And it's wonderful. I love the way Dorothy Whipple writes. I think she is a really brilliant creator of characters, and really has a real precision into writing about characters' emotions, and I loved young Anne so much. Then I also wanted to recommend The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall from 1928. I feel like I've been talking about The Well of Loneliness a lot lately, but basically what happened was I read The Well of Loneliness in June and it was so good, one of the best books I've read for years. Actually, this is my favourite Bildungsroman in this video, I lied. It's not the best book, it's The Well of Loneliness. I don't love it more than Wives and Daughters as a book, but as a Bildungsroman, maybe this is the best. The Well of Loneliness, it's one of those books that I read it and I thought it was so fascinating, and then I thought of lots of video ideas in connection with it, hence why there have been lots of videos mentioning this book lately. Anyway, The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall is a wonderful coming-of-age story following the character of Stephen Gordon from her birth through to when she's in her 30s, I guess. And we follow her life as a writer, as an ambulance driver during the First World War. We follow her life in London, in Paris, in the English countryside, and a lot of the book looks at Stephen's sexuality and the fact that people around her do not accept that she is attracted to other women, and the difficulties that causes in her life, as well as the great joy it brings her at times. This is a book that is called The Well of Loneliness and sounds really miserable, and it is a sad book in some ways, but it's also a really angry, powerful book. And I also think, as a Bildungsroman, it's fantastic. And we spend quite a lot of time in her childhood, and I feel like her childhood was so well written. And as with the Beth book, I feel like both Beth and Stephen's characterization and psychological complexity is drawn so well, and Stephen's development from childhood to adulthood. You see how her mind grows and you see how she develops as a person in such vivid detail, and it's fantastic, so I really, really recommend this. Then I also wanted to mention Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston from 1937. This is a wonderful coming-of-age story about Janie Crawford, an African-American woman living in the south of the US in the early 20th century, and we follow her from her sort of mid-teens, I think, her relationship with various men, her efforts to build a life for herself, and it's just wonderful. I read this a few years ago, I listened to it on audiobook, and I just absolutely loved it, and it's one I would really recommend. Another wonderful Bildungsroman from the US is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn by Bessie Smith from 1943, which follows Francine Nolan and her sort of early years growing up in Williamsburg, her relationships with her family as they fall in and out of poverty, and it's such a well-drawn novel with such amazing characterization. I read this a few years ago, and again, one that I just really loved and would highly recommend. Moving a bit later into the 20th century, I wanted to recommend Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga from 1988. Nervous Conditions is a coming-of-age story set in mid-20th century Zimbabwe, following this young girl as she grows up from her childhood to her teens. Nervous Conditions doesn't span quite as long a period of time as some of the other Bildungsromans, but I would definitely consider it a Bildungsroman. And it is also a series. I haven't yet read the next book in this series, so I assume we do follow her as she grows up. It's such a clever, powerful novel with wonderful characterization and a really complex look at growing up. It's a wonderful Bildungsroman in its own right, but I also think it's a really interesting, dissection of the Bildungsroman, because it is a post-colonial novel that has a lot to say about the legacy of colonialization in Zimbabwe, and the book in many ways mirrors a lot of 19th century British Bildungsromans like Jane Eyre, but it also turns certain things on its head, and I really loved how it plays with the form of the Bildungsroman and uses a literary form beloved by 19th century British writers to look at colonialism. I think it's just really fantastically done, and yeah, it's such a great book. It's such a great book. I read this at the end of last year and was just absolutely blown away by it. So yes, I would highly recommend that one. Another wonderful Bildungsroman is Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters from 1998. This is a wonderful novel about a girl called Nan. We follow her from when she's in her teens over several years as she leaves her hometown, travels to London, discovers more about herself and her sexuality. This is a work of historical fiction. It's set in the Victorian period, and it has a lot in common with Victorian Bildungsromans. I feel like it's a very very Dickensian book in many ways. It's also looking at a young queer woman and her navigating her sexuality and her identity within the Victorian world, and it's just fantastic. Moving into the 21st century, I wanted to mention Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I think is such a wonderful novel. I think about this book all the time. One of my favourite books ever. I've read it a couple of times and I kind of want to reread it. So anyway, we are following three characters, Kathy, Tommy and Ruth, from their childhood into their adulthood. And we know early on in their childhood that something isn't quite right about the childhood they are having. Something is off. And we learn later on in the book what that is and how that impacts all of their lives. And it's fantastic. It's beautiful. It's such a wonderful coming of age story, such a wonderful book about the meaning of life. That sounds so ambiguous and pretentious, but it's so good. Just trust me, it is wonderful. I love it so very much. I also wanted to mention The Long Song by Andrea Levy, a wonderful work of historical fiction that spans a long period of time in the 19th century. So it has the dates on the spine, which I think is really fun, 1800 to 1831 to 1850. And we're following a woman called July who was born into slavery in Jamaica in the 19th century. And we follow the course of a lot of her life, looking at her experiences and her trying to build a life for herself while in this horrible situation. And it's just such a wonderful, wonderful novel that I really heartily recommend. I also wanted to mention Washington Black by Essie Adujian, and it's one that I think you will love if you love Victorian Bildungsroman, because it has a lot in common with a Victorian Bildungsroman, and it feels incredibly Dickensian to me. So this book is about the character of Washington Black, a boy who grows up in slavery in Barbados and ends up, through various circumstances, travelling the world. And we follow his life, his relationship with the people around him, and the various adventures that he goes on, and it's so fantastic. I read this book probably like 6-7 years ago now, and I still think about it a lot. I think it's wonderfully, wonderfully written, and it's a really interesting take on the Bildungsroman. This book begins in 1830, and I feel like a lot of historical fiction does really interesting things with the Bildungsroman as a form, which is something I just really enjoy. Talking of historical fiction that falls into this category, I also wanted to mention The Confessions of Franny Langton by Sarah Collins. Actually, The Confessions of Franny Langton, Washington Black and The Long Song all have certain themes in common. In The Confessions of Franny Langton, the title character is telling us the story of her life. We know from the beginning that she is on trial for murder, and she explains how she ended up in this situation, starting off with her childhood growing up in slavery in Jamaica, how she ended up coming to England, and everything that has happened from there. And it is such a powerful novel. Finally, I have one more book to mention, a contemporary coming of age story that I would probably class as a Bildungsroman, and that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. So this book is the story of two people, well, three people really, Sam, Sadie and Marks. We follow these three friends over a number of years. The book starts when they're, I guess, about like 18, but we do flash back and see Sadie and Sam earlier on as children. And we follow their growing up and how these three people come together to make video games, and how working together affects their friendships, and how their friendships affects their lives. And I kind of love the idea of this book as a Bildungsroman, because it does follow these characters over a number of years, and they do change a lot. And we do really see how they influence each other, and that's something that I love about it. So I really love this book, and I think if you're someone who enjoys coming of age stories, you would find this really interesting. So there we go. That is way too many Bildungsromans for you to be getting on with. Do let me know down in the comments, what is your favourite Bildungsroman? What is your favourite coming of age story? And have you read any of these? Are there any more recommendations you have for me? That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.